All right. So thank you for inviting me to this live stream, and thank you guys for watching this live stream. So today, what I'm going to talk about is how to use advanced providers. So a little bit about me before I start. I'm a YouTuber, like a full-time YouTuber. My YouTube channel is the Happy Harris, and I also build a Udemy course on Flutter also. All right, so that's about me for now, but let's get on with providers. So what is a provider? So if you go to the provider documentation or even the PubDev website, simply is a wrapper for inherited widget. So some of you might think, what is an inherited widget? So for the longest time, I didn't know what's inherited widget. So an inherited widget helps you to pass data across your widget tree. So simply you have a data maybe at the top of your widget tree, and you want somewhere at the bottom or the third branch of your widget tree to access that data. So inherited widget helps you in allowing to pass some data in across your widget tree. So why use provider? Well, you've inherited widget, there's a lot of boilerplate. Provider helps us by reducing some boilerplate, and it also has a standard way to get data. So the difference between like the lines of code from an inherited widget and from a provider, you could see it's very stark. Like there's a huge difference in terms of code. So on your left side, it is how you implement an inherited widget. So I used to be a software developer in a startup, and I had a lot of inherited widget, and just maintaining it, it's very it took a lot of effort. But once provider was created, right, it made a lot of sense to just use provider because it cuts a lot of boilerplate, and you're able to use many providers in any way you can. And the standard way for you to use a provider is just by at the bottom right, provider.auth with the type of data that you're passing through and context. Sorry, that's an error. I forgot a semicolon, but yeah, bear with me here. So this is how you usually get data from a provider. So by calling this, it's very simple and it's even readable. So I'm going to just glance through the different providers, and I'm going to also at the same time going to talk about the more advanced. So stream providers, I would say it's very simply like a stream builder plus a provider. So an example that you guys might use is Firebase user. So Firebase user, you probably need its UID to access any data from Firestore, right? So you probably use a stream builder for you to get whether the user is logged in or logged out, and then you can use it in this simple on all state change stream. So it's like a stream builder plus provider, and then your other widgets down the line is able to get the Firebase user object. So I think this is hopefully a common provider that you guys use. Another common provider that you guys have used is this multi-provider. So you can have different types of provider put into one multi-provider. So for myself, I use this multi-provider at the top of the widget tree. So I have my stream builder, I have like maybe a proxy provider, which I will explain later, and I will have my change notifier provider, which I'm also going to explain later on. So all of these providers, usually most of the time, you will put it at the top of your widget, maybe just after your material app widget that you have created, and then you have your multi-provider, and the rest of your widget tree will be able to get the data once you put in any types of providers. So the next one is proxy provider 0. So there's a difference with proxy provider and proxy provider 0. So there is 0, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I had a video on my YouTube channel that's called Easiest Way to Create a Dark Mode for any app. So how is this implemented is basically you get the platform brightness from your, for example, iOS phone, whether it is in dark mode or light mode. And then you can use it to see whether it is dark mode. And then if you have a theme that you want to pass down through your different widgets, then you can use a proxy provider 0 to pass down the theme in your, for example, calculator app that I have here. Whoops, sorry about that. So I think this is the best way, because for the material theme, it doesn't have, like, for example, shadow color that can pass through the material theme data. So that's why I created my own like neuromorphic theme. So yeah, so this is how you usually use a proxy provider. So what's the difference between a proxy provider and a normal provider? A provider doesn't update, but a proxy provider does. So once, for example, if your phone is in light mode, it will actually change the, for example, in this context, the theme of your phone. So that's why I feel that proxy provider is a very good provider if you want to listen to a data that changes dynamically. So this is another way for you to use proxy provider. As you can see, the difference is that there is no number. So this proxy provider will actually listen to another provider inside a multi-provider. So you see here, there is the previous example, the stream provider that we use the Firebase user. And then we will have the proxy provider that listens to the user, Firebase user that we have created over here. So this will return a links collection, or like a, what do you call that? A Firestore collection that we can use it in the later part of your app. So you can use this proxy provider like this, and basically it just manipulates whatever data that you need, and then you can just pass it down the widget tree. And this is how I explain proxy provider visually using Firebase authentication. So you could see over here at the top, at this orange box, right? You have this multi-provider that you usually create at the top of your widget tree. And this is how I perceive like your multi-provider, like a box. And then the different shapes are your different widgets that are listening to this multi-provider. So inside this multi-provider, you have your Firebase authentication and proxy provider. So that means you have a stream provider, a proxy provider. And then let's zoom it in. And inside the multi-provider, you have this proxy provider that's listening to this user over here. So the stream provider actually will give us the user object once the user log in, for example. So once it does, then the user will be passed in to the proxy provider. Some animations here and there. I shouldn't do a slide, but then once the user is logged in, right, then the proxy provider will get the user object. And then inside the proxy provider, we will manipulate the user object to get, for example, a UID. And then this UID will be passed down in the different widgets that's listening to this multi-provider. So that's how you can use the proxy provider. Hopefully that explains clearly on this. Right, the next I'll call this is a bit advanced provider is this thing called Change Notifier Proxy Provider. So I'm going to explain in terms of the context of Cloud Firestore. So for example, if you were to do without any providers, right? If you want to add a list item, you have this add item button over here. So what it does is that, okay, I'm going to call my parent widget, my app bar, for example. And then after that, my app bar will then call my catalog to update how much list item I have. So once that's done, I will have update my, for example, a column of list item. And then I will have a new item over here. So that's another reason why you should use providers, because you could see that you need to jump a lot of steps for you to just add something, right? So another thing that you can use is also this thing called Change Notifier. So Change Notifier is not part of the provider package. It is already created inside the material package in Flutter, if I'm not wrong. So how this Change Notifier helps is that it gives a huge shortcut for you. So you will have an add item, and then you will just call it inside the Change Notifier. Then it will update my catalog using this function called notify listeners, which will update the UI accordingly, and then it will add the new item here. So now, what if we want to have the change notifier to be updated by the Cloud Firestore? So I had this case where I wanted to listen to the Cloud Firestore at the same time, but change notifier doesn't get updated. It will just remain the same and nothing happens. Because for example, if I want to have a bunch of list item inside my Cloud Firestore and suddenly there's a change, and the only thing that's helping me to change the different list items presented in the Flutter app is a change notifier, it doesn't really help. So the only way for you to do it is to use a proxy provider, because proxy provider is I think the only provider that allows you to update your different UI widgets accordingly from the outside source. So meaning that other than the internal widgets updating itself, other services like Cloud Firestore is able to, update the change notifier accordingly. So there's this huge thing called change notifier proxy provider. It's an actual provider widget. Yes. Don't be scared. It is pretty simple. So what this change notifier proxy provider does is that if you were to look at it, for example, it stores a state of 4, and then after that, the Cloud Firestore updates it. Okay, instead of 4 list items, we will have 5 list items instead. So what it does is that it will get the updated data, and then it will just update it to the number 5. So once it has updated data from the Firestore or any services, right, then it will actually call the my catalog to update its UI, and then you have a new item over here. Then this is how it looks like actually. So for example, if you have the add item to add another item in your catalog, it will update the UI. If the Cloud Firestore have an increased number of, for example, new item, it will also update the UI. So change notifier actually updates according to the user interaction and the Cloud Firestore interaction. So I have another example of a real use case that I personally use. So there is this thing called Linktree. Linktree. So what Linktree does is that it solves the problems of having an Instagram account, but you want to share more. So I personally love the idea, and I think to myself, like, I think this is a very simple app to be created. So instead, I use Flutter Web for me to implement this thing. So there is this use case where if you see correctly the LinkedIn and YouTube, it changes over here, and then it also changes over here. So I changed the position of my YouTube and LinkedIn link, and then it will also update the UI in the website itself. So I was thinking, I think this is fairly simple for me to create in Flutter Web. So this is how it looks like visually. So first thing is that the user will change the position of the links inside the website itself or an app. Then this will update the positions. The updated position will be saved locally. So my local storage or my cache or whatever will be saved locally. And then after that, inside the database in the cloud storage, it will be updated. And then in my, I call it Linktree landing page, will be also updated. So there's a lot of things going on when you change the position of your button over here. So I was thinking, how am I going to, replicate this user flow? So in the end, I used this change notifier proxy provider. So by having a simple widgetry over here, I have a change notifier proxy provider, and then I will change my button positions, which will then update in my change notifier proxy provider. And then this will then update the Firestore database, for example. And after that, it will change in my phone UI over here. So change notifier proxy provider helps in terms of not having like a jagged kind of workflow, because if I don't use change notifier proxy provider, there'll be a loading string to say that, oh, I'm updating the Firestore, and then it looks ugly, or the user experience is not very nice for any users using the app. So I find that change notifier proxy provider really helps. All right, so I'll give you an example on how I did it here. So you can see I've implemented something similar over here. So for example, if I were to change the earth and what is this bomb here, right? So if I change the position, right? So this is a reorderable list view. So if I change the position over here, it saves locally, and then my Firestore changes here at the same time. So this interaction doesn't have any loading or whatsoever. It just seamlessly update without any loading or any disruption of any user experience. So I think this is pretty cool. So I have a Udemy course that teaches you how to do this. So check it out. All right. So in terms of code, right, I have with me the button settings. So I divided this as a preview part of the screen, and this is called the button settings. So inside my button settings, I have with me here the change notifier proxy provider. So this will have the list of links, which is these links over here. And then I have a links notifier. So I use a change notifier over here. So one thing that I was a bit, this is just my UX thing, is just because my change notifier is being presented second, but the naming is change notifier first. So that's, yeah. But either way, it still works. So change notifier proxy provider requires two things. It requires your notifier, your change notifier in your create parameters, and under your update parameter, it uses your links notifier to update according to what changes you have, like for example, your Firestore. So this user links actually is from the Firestore itself. So let's look into the links notifier, which is basically a simple change notifier. And what it does is I have like a working list, and I have an update method to say that if there's new, then I will override the existing list to the user links over here. Then you will see this on reorder. So you will need this on reorder for this reorderable list view, because once it changes, right, then you have to, for example, update Firestore or whatsoever. So I have created an on reorder function for my change notifier over here. So what it does is basically it will just update the UI using notify listeners. This is just what you will normally do when you change your uh, list items. And then after that, like I said earlier, it will notify listeners, which will just internally saves the current working list positions. And then at the same time, after it saves locally, I will save it in Firestore. So I use batch. Batch is a little bit overkill, but basically it batches up all your reads functions. So, or read or update functions. So you have, like, for example, update data, and then I just update my position using the current index, and then I commit it. So with this on reorder function, right, I can just put it under my, where is it, reorderable list view. So another thing that I didn't go through is consumer. So you can think of consumer as a builder widget, but specifically for provider. And what consumer does is that it will only change the UI of the widget. So it only rebuilds the child or the builder widget. So it doesn't rebuild the whole screen. So that's advantage of consumer, if I'm not wrong. And then after that, you can use the reorderable list view. And then with the function that we had created earlier, which is called on reorder. Then with that, you can already just implement this simple, I would say, I think this is simple, simple user flow. So you change your position of your, what you call this, list item, and then it will change dynamically from the Firestore. All right. So, and another thing that I want to share also is this thing called Provider 4.1. So if you notice, Provider has already been updated to 4.1. So I have with me here a counter app that says Provider 4.1 sneak peek, right? So the thing about the current provider is that the author Remy, right? He used the extension for the build context. So now you can use these three methods: watch, select, and one more is called read. So I'm going to share with you on what are the different functions or methods that you can use in the new provider package. So instead of having like provider of context, right? So I think this is a bit too big. Let me zoom out a bit more. Okay. So for example, if I were to just comment this and then comment this. Normally, what you will do is you will have provider of, for example, CounterNotifier and then context. And then you'll probably have your methods inside your CounterNotifier. Okay, before I explain the what do you call that, the different or the new things in provider package, I will just explain to you what this app is. So it's a simple counter app. If you click on it, yeah, it will just increase accordingly. So I use change notifier for me to have this interaction. So inside my what do you call this counter notifier over here, um, what it does is it's very simple. You just have your initial value, which is 0, and then you have a getter method, and then at the same time you have a increment method over here, where it just use the increment operator to increase your value, and then it notifies listener because it will update the UI accordingly. So I have a very simple counter notifier over here. So I use this counter notifier or change notifier I have inside of my app over here. Then what you normally will do is that you will have provider of change counter notifier context, blah, blah, blah. And then for like a increment function, you will use listen. So that this parameters called listen equal to false, right? This is basically mean that for this part of the, what do you call this, counter notifier, you are not updating it because it's just a function. So a function doesn't need any updates. It just does stuff. So you will probably use listen false for any functions, but for any data, for example, the counter over here, right, you will probably need to listen to any updates, right? So that is just one thing that I want to point out, because there will be something later on that I will share with you guys. So now the next thing is that you will have this thing called watch. So counter context.watch counter notifier over here. So what this does is the same as provider.off. So let me see. So it's the same thing as provider.off, and then you have your context over here, right? Oops. So it's the same as this, but now using the extension method that Remy implemented in the new provider, you can just use this. So watch, what it does is it obtains a value of your provider, and then yeah, it is the same as this. It's literally the same. And watch, what it does, it reads and writes. So it reads and write. It reads and updates accordingly. So the next, so you can use this counter to just put in, like for example, a counter dot value to string. So it's the same thing as any other providers that you have called in. The next thing is this thing called select. So what select does is it only selects a particular property or method that you want to use. So you have you have context dot select, and then you will have for example, a provider, you will have the data that you want to pass in. For example, I have another class that's called bigger counter notifier. So the difference is that it will increment twice. All right. So in this select, you can just select a specific type of, like for example, property, right? So inside counter, you can just put this in select. Let me, so no, okay, then select. And after that, the value can be the counter notifier itself. Oops. Oops, what? Okay. All right, this is okay. Sorry, I'm using a new keyboard. Bear with me over here. And then you can put it counter notifier. And then you can specifically just return for example, the value over here. So what this select does, it only updates only gives you what you want, and you can also manipulate it accordingly. So you can put this into a block body, and then at the same time you can return it dot to string. So you can have this kind of manipulation or uh, changed kind of data inside, rather than you putting another variable for you to like change the, what do you call that, the counter into a string. So this is helpful if you really just want a specific property inside your change notifier, or even any type of objects that you're listening to. Right. So the last one, right, is called watch. So let me control that. Okay. Sorry. The last one is called context.read. So this context.read is a bit, how do I say this? It's something that you should, it's something that I have, basically I need to explain further. So what I mean by context.read, where is my context.read? Wait. Oh no. Okay, yeah. Okay, so over here, I have my multi-provider, right? So I use change notifier provider so that my homepage or this screen can listen to the different notifier. At the same time, I have another what do you call this object called bigger counter notifier. So what it does that it increase the value by 2. So from 4 to 6, for example. So there is this, maybe you want to have the counter notifier, for example, you want it to use the increment method. So what you need to do is you need to pass in the context using the read, what do you call it, method. So this read method, right, is basically how you are able to use a provide uh, a method from a different, for example, provider. So you pass in a context.read, and then inside your, for example, object over here or your class, right? You will use this thing called locator. So locator is just a type definition or a shortcut for you to say, oh, you're returning a function with a type. So it's usually used with the read method over here. So with this locator, then you can specifically say what kind of provider or change notifier you're listening to. So I'm listening to counter notifier. So I'm using its increment method. Then I have this method called add twice. So if I were to use this add twice method, I will actually increase its current value over here, but without me having to, use the counter notifier itself. I just use this locator, which is passed in through this context.read method. So yeah, so basically you don't need to, this is how you get a method from a provider without having to pass in a context, basically. So with that, I'm going to use it, and I'm just going to not use the increment method and use this increment method instead. So as you can see over here, oh, not this one, right? So I have this thing called add, and then I use this select method, and then I this add twice, what do you call this method that I've created inside my bigger counter notifier. So I'm going to copy this add method over here and paste it over here. So if I were to save this, and now my current value is 5, right? So if I press this, it will become, 8. Wait, 11. What does this add do? Increase by 3. Oh my God, what happened? All right, so yeah, it increased by 3. Let me restart this whole app again. It should be only increasing by 2. So 4. So increase by 3. Okay, I need to debug. But you get the point, right? You get the point. Basically, what it does is you help. For this context.read, it helps you to get the counter or any kind of object method using the provider method without using the context. Without using the context. Yep. Okay, so I think that's about it for providers. Okay, so this is just like a comparison of what are the different providers that I've gone through. So provider simply just gives data to the widget tree easily. Then multi-provider gives the data from a list of providers bundled into one provider, and then it will shove it into the widget tree. Then for stream provider, it just listens to a stream and then provides a result to the widget tree. So it's the stream builder plus provider itself. Then for this change notifier, it holds a state. So change notifier is some sort of a state management, and then it updates the user when the user interacts. So it updates the UI with the notify listener function. So change notifier provider just provides the state that the change notifier is holding and the updates that it is holding also. So it sends the data from change notifier to the widget. Proxy provider, it does not hold any state. So it just updates accordingly where whatever data that's listening to, for example, Firestore or even any API service that suddenly updates itself. And then lastly, change notifier proxy provider, it holds a state and then it updates when user interacts and when the data is listening. So it updates when the user interacts and when a change of data from a service is updated also. All right, so that's about it. Thank you. Right, I'm. If you guys have any questions, put it inside Facebook, even YouTube. Subscribe to my channel at the Happy Harris. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. It was pretty useful. Like one more state management pattern. Guys, please post, ask any questions in YouTube. And maybe I will ask again the very first one. Why do you prefer to use providers and not, why don't you use blocks or Redux?
All right, so provider, like I say, it's not I think I never mentioned it. So provider is not a state management. So provider is just a tool for you to pass down data from for example, your top of the widget tree down to the different widgets. So change notifier not part of the provider package, but it's a simple state management that the Flutter team have implemented. So then Remy saw that, oh, change notifier is actually simple. So why have this thing called change notifier provider to make use of this change notifier, what do you call that, state management kind of widget. Yep.
So do you use the provider or you use something else on top of provider?
For me, I don't use block or Redux because I haven't gone that level of, or maybe because like you say, I'm like the oldest kind of Flutter developer that you might have known. Before the actual block package was created, I had to create the block package itself, manually. So it wasn't the actual block package, but it was some sort of like inherited widget plus a little bit of the block logic, and then I have to create the inherited widget itself. So I guess that was the highest level of like state management I have used before, and that was a lot of maintenance, a lot of boilerplate code, which I really don't like. And then I have to do with streams and what do you call that? What streams and sinks? So I have to deal with streams and sinks. So I have to learn RX Dart also at the same time. So it was a lot of things going on.